So Anna Ridler, I'm just going to go in behind me, is an artist who currently is the Impakt artist in residence at the moment. So she's been upstairs working for the last 2.5 weeks, I believe, on a project which I'm sure she'll talk to you about today. And she's an artist whose work studies the materiality of machine learning, specifically GANs, which Luba kind of started to introduce. And she's shown at a variety of cultural institutions and galleries, including Ars Electronica, Sheffield Documentary Festival, Leverhulme Centre of Future Intelligence, Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, and the V&A. And she's a recipient of this year's EMAP programme and winner of the 2018-19 DARE Prize. So I'm going to stop talking and let Anna introduce herself. Thank you.
So I am going to talk about how I see machine learning. As Natalie mentioned, I'm really interested in using it as part of my artistic practice, but really around how you can start to use it to kind of do things with it rather than just kind of comment on it. And I'm really interested in the idea whether machines can create art and computational creativity. In particular, in relation to kind of painting and drawing, because painting and drawing have long been seen as like these essentially human qualities. And now that we're starting to get machines and algorithms that can mimic those, what does that mean for this kind of field? And the example that I always come back to is the idea of chess, because chess throughout history used to be seen as kind of like the most human thing you could do, like it was the peak of intellectualism. And as soon as you got Deep Blue, a computer that could beat a human at chess, this idea of chess being kind of like the supreme human achievement suddenly kind of started to drop. And I wonder whether the same thing was going to start with drawing and painting. And I think it's really interesting, the title of this talk, kind of deep fake, to consider in relation to this, because the idea that something is fake or faked implies both a hierarchy and an attempt to trick, which sometimes maybe might not be the case. It's certainly not necessarily the case in how I try to use that in my practice. So yeah, the artificial intelligence community has always been interested whether machines can create true, real art. And there's some anxiety, I think, around this. Jürgen Schmidt-Huber, a professor of artificial intelligence, created a formal theory of creativity back in the 90s, which tried to break down art into a series of novel patterns that a machine could learn. And then, so this is a picture that was produced last summer by researchers who trained in artificial intelligence using machine learning. It's a GAN, which I'm going to come back to, which Luba's already mentioned. On thousands and thousands of paintings in order for it to use this knowledge to then produce novel works. And what's interesting about this is that they then used human subjects to rate whether these works were better than works that were produced by people. And so they took paintings from, I think it was Art Basel, and the ones that were created by the GAN, and gave them to people to ask whether they were better or worse. And the works that were produced by the GAN were rated by humans as being better than works created by people, which is interesting. And what happens, so that in itself is interesting, that people are starting to think that work produced by machines is better than work produced by people. And for me, what's also becomes even more interesting is that they're now trying to teach robots to draw. Because drawing isn't just kind of copying, it's the ability to do lots of different things at once. It's the ability to kind of like collapse and edit and kind of take not just kind of what's in front of you, but learning how to emphasize things, what to choose to put in and put out. And this is a small video from DeepMind, who have recently reported that they've been able to train a machine to paint. And the words that they say is that they've been able to tell it how to capture the main traits of a face, such as shape, tone, and hairstyle, much like a street artist would. And the language that they're using, again, is really interesting because they're trying to train it like how a person would learn how to paint. But for me, it's still a little bit problematic because much of the focus of the work that's being done by the technical community has to consider and judge the results as art only through the impact of the visual parameters on a viewer. So, does it look like art? In this case, not really. They're just kind of they're blobs. But and using AI like this to kind of like create or just kind of like copy images or copy stuff kind of ignores something that could be quite interesting, and for me is really interesting, the impact of using it as a material and the intent of using it and the intent of the artist. And so this is something that I'm trying to explore in my work. So to explain a little, this is the only robot slide, I promise, in this presentation. But to explain a little bit about how a GAN works, because Luba mentioned it a lot in her talk, and a lot of the imagery that she showed are produced by a GAN, which is a generative adversarial network. So when working with these kind of things, when working with kind of like machine learning or AI, you essentially have two main materials: the data, so what you train it on, and the algorithm that runs it. And it's important to kind of like split these two things out because they are different, and you can kind of do different things with them. And so I'm going to talk predominantly about GANs, generative adversarial networks. It's a form of unsupervised machine learning that was invented in 2014, so not that long ago. And what's interesting is that it's still considered in the machine learning world to be notoriously unstable and to be not that well understood, despite the fact that it's the base technology is now being used for all of the things that Natalie was talking about and Luba was showing. It's a really complex iterative process with many interdependencies. But basically how it works is you've got two intelligences that kind of dance around each other to make images, and it's the unpredictable dynamics of these two intelligences that kind of create and shape what you then get. So for one GAN to be constructed, you have one kind of like intelligence that is trained on a series of images, which it then uses to try and create a realistic version of an image that could come from that data set. The second AI looks at these created images and then decides whether or not it's real or fake, true or counterfeit. So even within the kind of like the mechanism of the algorithm itself, you've still got this idea of real and truth, counterfeit and kind of like correct. And as this second network gets better and better at judging images that can and cannot pass, the first AI learns to mimic the imagery to the extent that the counterfeits are indistinguishable from the genuine article. And that's what's kind of written in the technical paper over the course of many cycles of learning. And again, so even kind of like embedded in the technical kind of like description of all of these things, you get ideas around truth and fake. And the reason why I kind of like come back to this is because I think it is interesting that even kind of like when these things are being invented, that there's still these ideas that they can somehow, they're lesser or kind of like incorrect by being the kind of like the wrong type of image, the less interesting. And what you get from kind of running these, this is an example of some of the imagery that has come out of a GAN. And these images aren't just parts of photographs that have been stitched together, but pictures that have been entirely generated or imagined of what the GAN thinks that it should be producing. And so they're morphing in and out. And because the way that this is working, the GANs are trained by collecting a training set representative of the desired output. You can make tiny minor adjustments to the algorithm that you run to make the neural networks converge on certain categories or certain things. And new imagery can be generated by moving smoothly through the space of images, which gives this kind of meandering, dreamlike quality to the results. And the results are recognizable as being real, but at the same time, they have small tells. So if you look really closely at some of the thumbnail images, like the pandas, you can tell that they look like pandas if you glance at them, but they're definitely not pandas. So that's kind of like how they kind of start to exist. But I'm interested in kind of like the quality of, I should play that, otherwise how artists are kind of like, otherwise it just stays on the porn one. And like the quality that these images kind of give artists. like Luba mentioned, that the GAN does have a certain aesthetic, which is kind of waterly and painterly, and the feeling of being kind of like touched by kind of like almost a non-natural organic intervention. The process of using a GAN, kind of like you do have this element of metamorphosis, like you're putting something in and it changes and you don't know what it's going to be. And this kind of quality is kind of like, within an art context, is way more associated, in my mind, with biology or nature than the digital, which tends to be much smoother and much cleaner. And this style, particularly in poorly trained models, so when you don't give it when you only give it a small amount of data or you don't give it enough time to learn, it kind of gives this very ruined, decayed, and decomposed look. And they're studied with kind of like these things called artifacts, which are the result of the process of the GAN learning. And these imperfections and traces of processes is something that comes out in quite a lot of the artwork that is being produced, or people who are using it in a creative way. But as kind of like Luba showed, this isn't something that's desired by the tech community. The tech community want realism. And so you've got this finite amount of time when you can do something with it and kind of use it off the shelf and still kind of get these traces of imperfection, which to my mind is something that is really interesting about using this kind of very, this technology. It's not a static technology. New versions of the algorithms are kind of like updated, and older ones are kind of like taken out. So when you're working with it, you're also working with something, and they all give very different looks. Like they all kind of like have their own kind of like language and kind of like aesthetic. And when you're working with them, like it adds a certain element of impermanence and temporality, because you can only use them for kind of like maybe sometimes even like 6 months before they change. So these are some of the things that I'm interested in looking at, and I'm trying to bring out in my work that I'm doing here as part of my residency. What I am doing is I am training an AI to create tulips. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I think there are some really interesting parallels that you can start to draw between 16th century or 17th century Dutch history, what's going on at the moment in terms of like speculation around cryptocurrencies, and AI. So it all sounds a bit mad, and this is just a small kind of video of the process that one of the neural nets that I started to train went through to kind of like start to build up the imagery. So Bitcoin has been described as being worse than tulip mania, and that was 5 years ago. And they're still seen as like a big speculation bubble with prices fluctuating wildly. But what is interesting is that in tulip mania, you also had the same kind of speculation going on with the tulip bulb. Tulips went for insane amounts of prices. You could buy a tulip for the price of a townhouse in the 17th century at the peak of the bubble, and then the price crashed and it became worth less than an onion. So I am really interested in kind of like bringing that out. One of the things that is interesting about using a GAN to do this is that the architecture of a GAN mimics the way that a stock market works. It seems to get better and better and better, and then it will suddenly collapse for no reason and suffer mode collapse, which can kind of like then echo kind of like using the material, what is happening with kind of like the collapse mirroring what goes on with speculative bubbles. The other thing that why I thought it would be quite nice to use is that there is the traditions of tulips in art history, where they were featured kind of like in the so-called vanitas paintings that illustrated the beauty and that beauty and treasure were often fleeting. And what also happens is that you would never normally get all of these flowers all at once. So that, again, even in the still lives, they would be imagined. So it's not a real painting. It's not representing reality. And again, so that's kind of like bringing that through. To make it, I had to construct my own data set to do it. So the data sets that are needed to make GANs are often extremely large. Thousands and thousands, sometimes millions of images and inputs are needed. And what's interesting is that normally they're controlled by large technology companies. Like, there are only a few number of kind of readily available large data sets that you can use to run these algorithms on. So while the algorithms for doing machine learning might be readily available, the data sets to run them on aren't. And to create your own data set is hugely time consuming. And I have spent kind of like 2 weeks photographing these tulips, but it's important for me to do this because this is one of the ways that you can start to wrest back control from these things. Because if you're using data sets that have been compiled by someone else, they inevitably become to enshrine the social, political, and cultural beliefs of the person who put them together. And there have been loads of different incidences of kind of like Google images not recognizing black people and labeling them as gorillas, or kind of like telling Asian people not to blink. And all of those things are because the data sets have not been kind of like big enough to reflect the reality. And for me, as an artist who's interested in the hidden and the forgotten, not being able to control that data set, not being able to look through everything is really important. And so to put together my own data set and to spend the time to kind of like put them all together is a way of kind of like pushing back and kind of like working and using it as a way of kind of like thinking through these ideas. So the process almost becomes like craft, kind of like repetitive and time consuming, but it also is something that is necessary, and and you do need to end up having a skill. So like if you make the data set too small, nothing will happen. And if you make it too big, it will collapse. So these are kind of like some of the ideas that I'm starting to think through and work with in my project to kind of like bring a different approach to kind of like creating these fake images and seeing if it's possible to do it in a more poetic and poetic way.